Remember how I said I'd go easy on you? I lied. You should have known better. I am the ultimate insanity. I am Carnage. Today on the Comic Book Report, Spider-Man Maximum Carnage. Stick around and check it out. Greetings, webheads. My name is Dominic, and you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And I'm finally getting around to arguably the best Carnage crossover there ever was. That's right, today we're talking about Spider-Man Maximum Carnage. So sit back, relax, and let's go ahead and get started with today's review. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Tom DeFalco, J.M. DeMatteis, Terry Kavanagh, and David Michelinie, and penciled by Mark Bagley, Sal Buscema, Ron Lim, Tom Lyle, and Alex Saviuk. The issues in this volume were published by Marvel Comics beginning in 1993. The volume itself collects Amazing Spider-Man issues 378 through 380, Spectacular Spider-Man issues 201 to 203, Spider-Man issues 35 to 37, Spider-Man Unlimited issues 1 and 2, and Web of Spider-Man issue 101 through 103. And finally, this standard size trade paperback comes in at 336 pages. At this time, I'd like to issue a brief spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection, as well as commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at that standard size trade paperback from Marvel Comics. It's a reprint of the Maximum Carnage crossover event. The paper stock included in this trade is a nice glossy print. It's a pretty thick paper. Overall, very pleased with its whole presentation. For me, Spider-Man Maximum Carnage is 90s comics done right. I love this early 90s stuff. It's before the art started looking too polished for me, or computer colored or assisted. I don't really know how to describe it. But early 90s art to maybe even mid 90s art, I think is absolutely stunning. After that point for me, it gets a little too computery or polished. So for me, this is right in the sweet spot. I mean, we have Mark Bagley, we have Ron Lim. We just have some incredible artists on this book. But before we dive too much into the art, let's dive into the collection proper, and let me give a little bit context for this event. This, to my knowledge, is the first big Carnage crossover story arc, and for my money has always been probably my favorite Carnage story if I had to pick one. I did cover the birth of Carnage in a previous video last year on my channel. I do like the origin of Carnage as well. Overall, this character for me is truly disturbing. I find myself always very unnerved by his general presence in Spider-Man comics. For me, Spider-Man's villains, while some of them are murdering or crazy or wild, I generally don't find many of his villains truly disturbing, and I just can't say that about Cletus Cassidy, also known as Carnage. He is a legitimate serial murdering killer who is just a complete psychopath who is imbued with Venom's kind of offspring symbiote to become Carnage. And that mixture is so potent and so wild. And so to have him just unleashed on New York, it's just frightening. And to see that in this crossover, right away I was interested, I was hooked, and I was already thrown off balance just because it is a Carnage story. The story starts with a kind of prison breakout where the Carnage symbiote is unleashed from Cletus Cassidy's blood while he's institutionalized and held captive as a prisoner. And from there, it just keeps escalating and growing until the whole city's embroiled in this crazy battle between a team of good guys versus bad guys. As far as the actual plot goes, it's nothing in my mind that's absolutely mind-bending or brand new. But for what it is, it's done very effectively and very well. There's a very clear sense of stakes, conflict, and menace throughout all of it. Cletus Cassidy, Carnage, is just such an upper-tier villain as far as the threat he poses as compared to some of the other Spider-Man villains. And so right away upon his release, it's just kicked into overdrive, the threat and the fear. Carnage kind of gathers a team of villains around him. I believe he starts with Shriek. By the end of the collection, we also have the Demi-Goblin, this creepy Spider-Man monster doppelganger character, and Carrion. And then it forces Spider-Man to team up with kind of his band of, kind of heroes. We have Black Cat, we have Cloak and Dagger, we have Firestar, we have Deathlock, we even have Captain America. But I think most surprising on the list of heroes that is aiding in the, capture and just stopping of Carnage is Venom. Not quite a hero, but someone who is heavily vested in taking down Carnage, who he feels directly responsible, having created him. And with those cast of heroes and villains, essentially the line is drawn, and throughout this book, we just have a lot of clashes and battles. It is a non-stop, wall-to-wall, just action slugfest throughout this whole run. I think, frankly, with so many titles, I think there are 4 or 5 different Spider-Man books in this crossover event. I'm really impressed with how seamless this whole crossover feels. I think for me, this could almost read as one big story arc, and I think that's in my mind, that's the evidence of a really good crossover. I think some crossovers that have tie-in issues do an okay job, but I much prefer a crossover when it's completely collected and it's like you're reading one seamless story for the most part. And I think overall, that's what I feel reading Maximum Carnage, and I think that was just done very well. I think some of these secondary level heroes that also ally themselves with Spider-Man in this fight, with Black Cat, Cloak and Dagger, and some of these, I think it also added this kind of fun level of hero versus villain story. I like that it's not all the Avengers. Yes, we have Captain America, but I like that it's more of this B or C list heroes, the more street level heroes that are trying to stop this crazy menace. Another prominent point I like about Carnage, and because he's such a just drastic evil villain, it pushes Peter Parker, Spider-Man, to the edge on what is he willing to do to stop Carnage? What lengths is he willing to go to? Is he willing to kill Carnage to stop him if that's what it takes to rid the world of this evil? And what would that mean for him? What would that mean for his moral code? Can he go through with it? What separates a hero from a villain? What separates, man from monster? And I think that that's something that Peter Parker deals with within his own psyche throughout this, but it's also compounded, I think, with the character of Venom. His inclusion in the kind of hero roster of trying to take down Carnage at this point in his history is pretty groundbreaking, at least in my opinion, and I do like to see it. And I think that adds even more complex layering to that question of what makes a hero? What is a man versus a monster? I don't know if I'm overinterpreting here, but I really liked finding myself asking those questions while reading this comic. I think that another thing I enjoy about Maximum Carnage, and you can see it as I flip through here, is just the art. I mentioned it at the top of the video, but it has some of my favorite artists, especially ones from the 90s, with like Ron Lim, Mark Bagley. Those are some of my top tier guys I love to see. Ron Lim, ever since I reviewed and checked out him in Silver Surfer, I was just hooked by his style. And then I've long been a Mark Bagley fan. I love him in Ultimate Spider-Man. I loved reading, one of his more modern ones with Spider-Man Life Story. And I know he's obviously done so much more than that, including Maximum Carnage here. And for me, it's not just the general beauty of the art, which is very, very good. I love the character models we see throughout this Maximum Carnage arc. I think they're all really well defined and very distinctly their characters, which I always appreciate. But I think also the way that they all tear through the city in this story arc, you really have a lot of artists that convey a good sense of place. You can feel yourself just barreling through New York and through all these like battle-strewn streets and things like that, and it gives you a really good fixed sense of place, and I really love seeing that as well. I think we also are treated to a lot of kind of 90s, kind of more experimental panel layout. I think it's, for modern readers, it might still look a bit aged, for those that only read modern comics. But for people that read like a vast array of comics, I think that the 90s for me really stand out with panel layout experimentation. I think Todd McFarlane immediately comes to mind of how he just pushed the limits of a Spider-Man book and art paneling and laying out. And we see some experimentation in this volume as well. There's some really great splash pages. There's some like kind of landscape pages. There's some just really interesting panel layouts. And overall, I felt myself really interested. I think that while it can feel a little dated, it certainly feels like it's pushing the medium forward at the time that this was put out, at least in my opinion. And then, I don't know if this is a superficial level, but I will highly recommend Maximum Carnage for people that really like an action-heavy or action-centric superhero book. I think that this has some of the best battle scenes I've read in quite a while. I love just how striking and loud and explosive a lot of the action sequences are conveyed. I think there's a really good sense of motion throughout a lot of this comic, and, there's just a there's a wake of destruction behind Carnage everywhere he goes in this series, along with some of the other villains like Demogorgon and Shriek and, his other cavalcade of just minions. And I think that it's just pretty eye-opening. I don't always see comics go this bonkers, and I love seeing that. I think the last time I read an action scene in a comic that really struck me was obviously some of the stuff we see in Invincible. I think Invincible also does incredible action sequences. And yeah, generally, there's just a lot to love from that standpoint in Maximum Carnage. Maximum Carnage is a 14-issue crossover series, and I think that while I do love the length in some ways, I think maybe one of the potential drawbacks of this is I think it was maybe a little bit bloated. There were a couple times reading this where I felt like it sagged a little bit or didn't quite have me as eager to flip the page. That wasn't overly common, as like I said, the action sequences were all there. I think it asked some hard questions, and we got to see some fun character moments for both our main hero, Spider-Man, but also for, of course, the main villain, and then obviously Venom as well, among others. And so I do think it was still effective, but there were points where I feel like it dragged on. It does make me wonder if this could have been a tighter, maybe 6 to 8 issue series. But I'm still really happy with what we get overall with Maximum Carnage. This is still an earlier Carnage appearance, so he's still a pretty fresh character, and I think some of these early appearances are, in some ways, some of my favorite Carnage appearances. I feel like sometimes as I move forward, even if the books get a little more violent, I lose some of the initial menace I have reading some of these first appearances from the character. I don't know how to describe it. I know I covered it when I covered, the Carnage origin about a year ago, but I feel a lot of that same kind of creepiness and menace and just unsettledness every time I see Cletus Cassidy or Carnage on print. Another demographic I would highly recommend Maximum Carnage to, if it wasn't evident already, is for fans of Venom. I know there's been a huge influx of just interest in the character since Donny Cates' run on the title and all of the King in Black stuff, so we have a lot of new Venom fans that are coming out of the woodwork or just kind of dabbling in comic book appearances, and I would say for fans of Venom who want to go back to some of the earlier Venom work, I highly recommend reading Maximum Carnage. At this point in his history, he's still largely a villain himself, but we see him framed almost as more of an anti-hero in this role, and I think it's really fun to see. His relationship with Spider-Man and Carnage in this saga here is definitely one worth noting, and it's a key point in the history of all three characters. So if you enjoy the character of Venom, I would consider this a must-read. Obviously, if you're a fan of Carnage as well, I would consider this a must-read. If you're a fan of Spider-Man, I would say that this is an important crossover, but as far as a must-read, I would say it depends on what kind of Spider-Man fan you are. I'm sure there are those that just don't like Carnage, maybe don't like Venom at all, and I totally respect that. But it's still a pretty pivotal little crossover that has a lot of milestone character interactions and character moments. And as we begin to make our way through this final issue in this collection, one more thing I'll say about this trade paperback specifically is I would have hoped to have gotten more extras. Granted, this is an older trade paperback, so I know extras, weren't as prevalent or as much in some of these older reprints, but there's really not much at all after the issues in this book, which is fine. Obviously, the issues are the real meat and potatoes, the real, actual point of these collections, but I would have loved to see more extras. We have an afterword, but not a whole lot else, and I think that might have been a little bit of a missed opportunity. But overall, not too much to complain about with this collection, and that's Maximum Carnage. And now that we've finished out this collection here, I think all that's left to do is give Spider-Man Maximum Carnage a grade. For a fairly seamless crossover event that aptly showcased a lot of spectacular early 90s comic book art, The Comic Book Report is happy to give Spider-Man Maximum Carnage a B-. This is an above-average collection for me that is definitely a must-read for Venom and Carnage fans out there. While there are moments that this collection dragged on, perhaps unnecessarily, overall I was treated to a spectacular ride. I think that Carnage was absolutely menacing and posed a serious threat to our hero and the city at large. Perhaps one of this collection's most striking features, however, is the team aspect, the team of heroes and the team of devious villains. To watch them fight it out through all 14 of these issues was something to behold. Have you read Maximum Carnage? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Have a good one.